Hello everyone, it's Christina Richardson here, the celiac disease dietitian, and welcome to my very first YouTube video. Today I'm going to be talking about not so much celiac disease, but gluten intolerance. So I started a Facebook group not long ago and lots of people have been asking to join, which is great. I created it specifically for people with celiac disease, but I have been getting a lot of people asking to join who don't have celiac disease. They have gluten intolerance. So I did think long and hard about whether to include these people in the group, and I decided I would. And this video is the reason why. So it's because first of all, I do see quite a lot of people in my practice who have been told they have gluten intolerance or otherwise believe they have gluten intolerance, when in fact there may be another thing going on altogether. So I just wanted to do a quick video talking about this, because if there's one thing I really hate, it's seeing people restrict their diet unnecessarily. So here we go. So there's a number of reasons someone would consider themselves gluten intolerant but not celiac. The first and probably the most common reason is that they suspected some time in the past that gluten may be causing some sort of issue for them because of the symptoms they get when they eat it. So naturally they start to reduce it in their diet, and when they do, they feel better. However, if this is the case and then afterwards you find out that maybe you could be celiac, but then you find out the only way to get tested for that is to go back on gluten. Now, for some people, this is an unthinkable task because when they eat gluten-containing foods, it makes them feel so awful. So this is a common scenario, very common, and if this is you, then first of all, I just want to say it's okay. I understand completely. The gluten challenge protocol, which is 4 slices of bread a day for 6 weeks, is enough to make any person with celiac disease quiver in their boots. But really, if this is you, you have 2 choices. You can either do the challenge and find out for sure whether you have celiac disease, or don't do the challenge and then wait until some point down the track there is a test that doesn't require you to eat quite so much gluten. Now, if you take the second option, then ideally you should probably consider yourself celiac until you find out otherwise. And then just be as strict with your diet as a person with celiac disease would. The second reason someone might consider themselves gluten intolerant is they maybe have undergone some variation of investigations in the past to find out whether they had celiac disease. And at the time, the results of those tests or investigations came back negative. But even though it's negative, they still pursue a gluten-free diet because gluten really seems to cause a problem for them. Now, if this has happened to you, I just want to flag that there is the possibility that you may actually still have celiac disease, but for some reason or other, it wasn't picked up at the time. There are unfortunately quite a few scenarios where this can happen. The most common one is that you may not have been eating enough gluten at the time of your test for the result to be accurate, especially if you're a person that cut a lot of gluten-containing foods out of your diet already because they were giving you trouble. So as I said, 4 slices of bread a day for 6 weeks before undertaking testing is the current recommendation, and that protocol is good at picking up almost all cases of celiac disease. So another scenario might be where you were tested quite a number of years ago and you may not have had the right combination of serological screening tests, so that's the blood tests that look for celiac antibodies. So these days there is a standard combination of 2 or 3 different tests that when they're done together, they're really quite accurate at picking up celiac disease. But this wasn't always the case because the tests have changed over the years. Now, the main reason why they recommend doing at least 2 antibody tests at the same time is that some people are naturally deficient in IgA antibodies. And if they are, the most common test used for celiac disease, which is the tissue transglutaminase or TTG antibody test, won't work. So they need to always check for IgA deficiency at the same time, or the alternative is to run a separate test that doesn't measure IgA antibodies, and that is usually the deamidated gliadin peptide, or DGP test. Now, young children also have quite low or erratic levels of antibodies. So that's why it's sometimes difficult to test, well, actually it's quite often difficult to test for celiac disease in young children. And their tests may come back negative even when they do have active celiac disease. So that's something to keep in mind. So negative now doesn't mean negative forever. And if you've previously tested negative to a blood test in the past for celiac disease, it's worth looking back through your records and seeing what tests you actually had, especially if you strongly believe that gluten is a problem for you. Now, even if you have an endoscopy and that comes back negative, well, there's actually still a chance that result could have been wrong. Why? Well, it used to be standard practice to only take one biopsy, one little bite of tissue in the small bowel, and look at that under a microscope. But now what they know is that several samples actually need to be taken because the damage from celiac disease can be a bit patchy. So if you only have one sample that's from a section of your duodenum that doesn't have damage, or it only has slight damage, then that's not going to accurately reflect the status of your disease. So it's important that multiple samples were taken from multiple places. It's also notoriously difficult for the pathology lab to get it right when looking at the tissue from your bowel. So it's not just a simple task, it takes a very skilled pathologist. They have to slice it correctly, they have to get the orientation just right, and then make sure they get the measurements correct. So sometimes they get it wrong. I remember years ago hearing of a very knowledgeable and respected gastroenterologist in my field who he was so certain his patient had celiac disease, but the sample just kept coming back negative. He sent it back to the lab 3 times, asking them to check it before it came back with the correct result. So that's just another thing to be aware of. You always want to have a very experienced gastroenterologist who's doing your workup of your diagnosis. So if you have a sneaking suspicion that any of these things apply to you, then maybe you should think about getting testing done again. Or if you can't bear the thought of eating gluten again, then refer back to my first point. Now, there is a third reason why someone would come to the conclusion that they have a gluten intolerance when it may not be the case. And that is that they have been diagnosed by someone who is either not qualified to make that diagnosis, or they've been given the results of a test that's not reliable. Now, before I get into what I mean by that, I just want to clarify a couple of things. So there are 3 main adverse food reactions related to wheat and gluten. The first, of course, is celiac disease, which, as we know, we can test for as long as gluten is being eaten regularly at the time. The second is food allergy, and this is specifically a wheat allergy. So with a wheat allergy, just like other food allergies, the reaction is usually very immediate and it's replicatable, meaning every time the food is eaten, the same reaction happens. And it's usually in a very short period of time, like minutes, usually within half an hour at least. So food allergies can be diagnosed by a specialist doctor, an allergist or an immunologist, and they will use a combination of certain tests like skin prick tests and blood tests, as well as a detailed assessment of the patient's history. Okay, so that's allergies. The third type of adverse food reaction that involves gluten or wheat is a food intolerance. Now, a food intolerance is the most difficult thing to diagnose. Now, I might upset quite a few people by saying this, but a food intolerance cannot, and I repeat, cannot be diagnosed just with a test, okay? So if you have in the past had some sort of hair strand test or a saliva test or even a blood test, which has been sent off to a lab and come back with a list of foods you are supposedly intolerant to, I want you to rip that list up and throw it in the bin, okay? Those tests as nice as it would be to have such a simple non-invasive test, they're not worth the paper they're written on, okay? The only way you can diagnose a food intolerance is through a controlled elimination and reintroduction protocol, okay? So a dietitian who works in this area would do that by taking a very detailed client history, doing a lot of investigative questioning, and then only when they are quite sure that they know what the particular intolerance may be, they will prescribe a specific elimination diet, which would usually be for a period of many weeks, where the suspect food or foods would be either substantially reduced or eliminated from the diet. And then after that elimination period, if it appeared to give a resolution of symptoms, then they would go about reintroducing foods in a ordered, structured way so that the exact food or food component that's causing the issues can be identified. Okay, so dietitians would never just give a blanket instruction to stop eating wheat or dairy or any other food group unless we've first had convincing evidence from that protocol that was followed, that it was necessary for your symptomatic relief. Okay, we're very passionate about keeping people's diet as wide and varied as possible, and the unnecessary exclusion of foods is unfortunately something we see in practice all too often. Now, the other thing about food intolerances is that before you go down the route of looking into whether you may have one or not, it's important to rule out any other potential medical issues first. Okay, so celiac disease is just one very important example of what should be ruled out, and your doctor will probably want to rule out others as well. And that's because the good news about a food intolerance is that unlike celiac disease, a food intolerance doesn't require such a strict diet. Okay, so you can essentially find your own personal threshold for the food that's giving you trouble. You may be able to have a little bit without any symptoms, and if that's the case, then it's absolutely fine to do so, okay? There's no damage being done internally with a food intolerance, unlike celiac disease, and there's no risk of anaphylaxis as there would be with a wheat allergy, okay? It's just a matter of managing symptoms that may be unpleasant or uncomfortable for you if you have too much. And you can work that out through experimentation. Okay, so also with a food intolerance, you may find that it's only temporary. You may have a problem with a certain food for a while, and then years later you may be able to start reintroducing it. Okay, so it's not a lifelong diet like it is for people with celiac disease. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify all of that because I really hate seeing people on strict diets when they don't have to be. Okay, so I'd like you to ask yourself, do you have a gluten intolerance? Has anything I've just told you make you question whether this is the case? Let me know in the comments. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. Now, I haven't touched on the topic of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and I haven't touched on the topic of FODMAPs either, because those are whole other kettles of fish, which I will talk about in future videos if you'd like me to. Okay, so make sure you subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss those or any of my future videos, and I'll talk to you soon.